Hi and welcome. My name is Peg Checky. I'm with the Center for Teaching Excellence and Innovation here at Rush. Going to be talking to you today about feedback and about grades and how to do effective feedback and what's important about feedback. Key thing to remember is that it's terrifying to most people, so we need to be sure that we're approaching it with a good mindset. And to that end, we're going to talk a little bit about definitions and some different options besides what we normally are used to, perhaps. Some keys to success. Give a quick nod to plagiarism because I know that a lot of people worry about that. And then hopefully we'll have a few minutes left at the end for a wrap-up. The overall objectives for the day are to cover some online assessment techniques that you can use, to look at your time and comfort issues. A lot of people really are locked in because they don't have the time to do something different, or they think they don't have the time. I'm hopefully going to offer some solutions for that. We're going to talk about some different alternatives to the standardized test, and we're going to document some online tools and resources that you can use. Now, I don't know about you, but when I hear the word test or exam, I tend to flip out a little bit. My heart starts pounding. My palms might get sweaty. I'm sure that I'm going to fail no matter how much I've studied or not studied. This was me back in the day. I've gotten a little bit better over the years, thank goodness. But most of us feel some level of tension or worry or frustration. Some of us get really mad when tests come up. You get really, emotions kind of run the gamut. Some people look at tests as challenge, and that's good for them. Doesn't do much for those of us that are normal, though. In any case, it's really important that you remember that some fear is not a bad thing. Using fear as a motivator, it's a very strong motivator. It's not the best thing in the world, though, and so you want to make sure that you're using it sparingly and appropriately. Mainly, as educators, our goal is, and I think everybody at Rush gets this, our goal is to help students learn the techniques and tools and skills that are going to guide them throughout their professional lives. Not just the hard skills, the surgical techniques or the case diagnostic techniques, not just that, but also the soft skills, communication, different ways of approaching different issues that patients might bring to them. So, we want to look at education as the act or process of imparting or acquiring general knowledge, developing the powers of reasoning and judgment, and generally preparing oneself or others intellectually for mature life. I didn't see anywhere in there where it said passing a multiple choice quiz. And I didn't see anywhere in there where it said that education was about instilling fear, terror, panic in our students. So I think it's important that we look at that, we revisit the definition of education periodically, remind ourselves what we're doing. More importantly, I think it's important to use the assessment as a tool to guide the students and then convince the students that this is the purpose. Because no matter how many times I say it, I'm still going to have students who panic at the thought of having an exam. And they're going to be convinced that their lives are ruined if they fail. Again, I applaud their motivation. I applaud the willingness to sacrifice their sanity to pass my class. But at the same time, I wonder, are they really learning, or are they just passing the test? And I'm not sure that that just passing the test is what I want them to be thinking of. So I talk about assessment right from the beginning. It's an action or an instance of making a judgment about something, the act of assessing something. Notice that I was saying earlier we don't want exams to be a judgment, and yet here we are talking about assessment being a judgment. So I think it's a little bit of semantics here, but most importantly, just note that I use assessment as opposed to test or exam, and the reasons why. So the first reason is that for me as an instructor, it encourages me to think of other ways to assess learning, right? So I want to, if I just think of it in terms of a test, well, I'm going to write a test. If I think of it in terms of assessment, I'll think of other things I might be able to do. Certainly using assessment reduces the fear factor somewhat. And finally, I think, and this is the most important one, assessment allows for the opportunity for growth and change. It's not necessarily final. It's not quite as definitive. It has a softer tone to it, so that, because really when it comes down to it, student development talks about how they grow. from when they join your class to when they end your class. And ideally, you want them to, wherever they start on that spectrum, you want them to grow to a higher plane. Not all of them are going to start at the same level. Not all of them are going to end at the same level. But your goal is to get as many of them to the highest standard that they can achieve as students. Let's talk for just 1 minute about formative versus summative evaluation assessment. So formative is using tools to monitor student learning to provide ongoing feedback that can be used by instructors to improve their teaching and by students to improve their learning. So it's done during the course. It's typically lower stakes. It's designed to support the student learning and ensure that the content is understood. I apologize for reading the slide, but that's an important definition. Summative assessment is done at the end, and it's at the end of an instructional unit. You can do a summative assessment at the end of a week. You could do a for that learning of that week. You could do a summative assessment at the end of a course. You can pick when you implement a summative assessment. The key difference is, though, one is going to be monitoring the learning to make sure that they're getting it. The other really important piece about this is that whatever assessment you choose to use, you want to make sure that it aligns with your learning objectives. We'll talk a little bit more about learning objectives down the road, but essentially learning objectives are what drive your course, or should be. So you should have unit learning objectives, you should have course learning objectives, you should have program learning objectives, you should have college learning objectives, and then ultimately the university has objectives that they want students to walk away with. So it's a hierarchical sequence. Unit objectives are important for each unit. So if you're not writing those, you should think about doing that. It will help you to guide your class. Obviously, with standardized testing, there's pluses and minuses, right? So standardized testing, one size fits all. And it's really simple and straightforward, and the questions are laid out in advance, the answers are laid out in advance, you either get it or you don't, yada, yada, yada. The downside for standardized testing is that not all students are the same. Not all students learn the same way. Not all students test well. Hello, that was me. So if you give a standardized test to a student who panics at standardized tests, they're not going to do very well, and it doesn't really represent what they're capable of, I don't think. So when you're thinking about standardized testing, they're very systematic with a very predictable format. At the same time, they're kind of boring, and students are only going to be studying for the test. They're going to be studying for the express purposes of passing the test. Is that really truly learning, or is that just taking in information so that you can perform a task? Circus monkeys can do repetitive tasks, but it doesn't really mean that they understand what they're doing or why. So I always go for, I try to look at that when I'm developing assessments. Standardized testing is good because it's objective. You either know it or you don't, right? That's important when it comes to some foundational pieces. And certainly when you come to, if I need to know the muscles of the body, I need to know really what the muscles of the body are. I can't guess. I can't say, well, I think it might be that, or you either know it or you don't. So there again, on the flip side of that, the minus might be, are there other ways to assess that if I can't test well? A standardized test isn't going to give me that chance. And of course, the most important thing in a medical school or a medical university, health sciences university, is that it's good prep for the different board exams and certifications that students have to take in order to succeed, right? So they have to do some. What I would argue, though, is that instead of using them as the end-all be-all for your course, use them as exercises, use them as practice, give them the standardized tests so that they do prepare, but don't make it the end-all 100% weight of whether or not they pass or fail your course. Because again, the test anxiety will just kill the results, and people that might otherwise be really successful implode. They definitely, can't say it strongly enough, these standardized tests definitely have their place, but they're only one measure. So don't hang everything on that one. So the question I always get at this point is, well, what else are we supposed to use? And this is where I jump in and say, wow, this pool is so deep. I mean, there are so many different ways. I'm not even going to be able to scratch the surface. Talk a little bit about authentic assessment, talk about micro-assessments, self-assessments, group assessments, and then some low-stakes activities you can add in as well. So authentic assessment is my favorite tool of choice. I love authentic assessment because to me it cements the learning between what they're supposed to be learning versus what they're supposed to be doing in their life as they go forward. So authentic assessment, you need to think of it in terms of case studies, in terms of grand rounds, in terms of what they're actually doing, finger sticks, blood pressure, giving somebody a shot, drawing blood. All of those things are authentic assessments when they do it on a real person, right? Or even when they mimic doing it on a real person, even when they do it in a false setting with willing participants. Hopefully the participants are willing in a virtual situation like we're in now. Those are still authentic because they still apply to real world learning and to what they're actually going to be doing. It's not just theory. It's not just it's not just some ethereal idea of what they're supposed to be doing. They're actually authentically doing it. So the key behind authentic assessment is, does this translate into a real world experience for the students in some way? When I talk about micro assessments, I'm talking about just little tiny things that you do during the course of your presentation. Maybe you're doing a Zoom lecture and you pop in a poll. That's a micro assessment. You're assessing a couple of things there. Are they paying attention? Are they looking at are they listening to what you're presenting? Are they looking at your slides? Maybe it's a quiz, maybe it's a poll, maybe it's just a quick discussion. But all of those are little things that you're doing to assess where they're at. Now, if you add a checklist to it, it becomes something that's documented and documentable. So you can use an observation checklist as you're having them do these different little assessments. Especially things like if you were to use, for example, again, I'll use Zoom. If you were to use a breakout room and put everybody in breakout rooms, you got 4 different rooms, 4 different groups of students. You go from one room to the next, to the next, to the next. You are assessing what they're doing in there. Are they talking about the party they had last week? Or are they talking about, I don't know, myocardial infarctions, right? If they're talking about what they're supposed to be talking about and working on the problem that you've given them to do, then they are in fact learning. Right? That's the definition of learning. They're growing as a group. You can document that by using an observation checklist. This is what I saw when I went into the group. And make notes about who's talking, what are they saying. Just some things that'll refresh your memory when you go back to put a grade in the grade book, if you want to use that as an actual assignment grade. One thing I absolutely love are self-assessments. Students are always going to be harder on themselves than you are. By definition, all students are just convinced that they're awful, especially when they're in the company of people that are really good at what they do. So self-assessment, ask the students to do self-assessments. It does a couple of things. First of all, it gives you language as to where they need to improve, right? Where they feel they need to improve. If their self-assessment matches your assessment, then you've got a perfect intro to a discussion you can have with them at a midterm review, perhaps, or you could have some way of talking about, what their self-assessment said, maybe in a discussion forum or a private chat. But you can, getting them to self-reflect and getting them to actually review how they think they're doing is going to give you the language that you need to then turn it around and say, okay, that's what you think. Here's what I see. And as the professional, as the expert, you're going to be able to turn that around and make it valuable for them. Even if their self-assessment is horrible, you'll be able to turn it around and make it a learning experience for them. Group assessments are also good. I didn't put it on the list. I should have. Group assessments are great. I don't like group assignments necessarily. I like group assignments because I want people to work together. I do not want to grade the group as one. I want to grade the people in the group individually, because you know and I know that anytime you get a group of people together, some people are going to do most of the work. Some people are going to cheese off on the side and, not do anything. Oh, sorry, I was busy. Oh, I can't be at the meeting. I'll get you next time. So, you're going to have people that are not participating as much as they should. So when I do a group assignment, I make sure that I get them to identify what exactly each participant is responsible for and what they did during that group assignment. I also have them assess each other's participation and have them assess each other's contribution. In doing that, I end up getting their thoughts about how well they did. They tend to be more critical than I would be. So not always, but sometimes. And so I can use their language and flip it. Absolutely love rubrics when it comes to doing this kind of stuff. We'll talk about rubrics in a minute. The last thing on the list are low-stakes activities, things like discussions, case studies, simulations. There's a million of them. You can do 1-minute papers. I'll give you a list of hundreds down the road, a couple of lists that add up to hundreds. I'll give you a bunch of lists you can look at. You can decide what you like, what you don't, take what you like and leave the rest, as they say. The idea behind these small activities is to, again, constantly reinforce the learning points that you want to make with your students. So it's not a one and done. I gave my lecture, they sat and listened to the lecture. When we're done, we'll take a test. No, instead, you're going to give them a lecture, sure. You're going to talk about things back and forth, hopefully in a Zoom session or in person eventually someday, right? You're going to have them maybe do a discussion board. Maybe you'll have them do a couple of case studies. You'll have them work with the material. You'll have them use that information that you've given them and apply it somewhere. Again, authentic assessment, low stakes authentic assessments. They reinforce the learning. They build the student's confidence. So, so important for success. 3 things that I truly love to use: project-based learning, right? Peer-to-peer learning and group-based learning. Project-based learning, I use the example of a capstone that I use in my class when I teach a class. My background, for those of you that don't know yet, is culinary. I'm a chef by trade. It was a long journey to higher education, but here I am. My background in culinary education, I teach at the BA level, and my last project, the last class the students have to take, they have to get through me before they can graduate. They have to do a capstone. And in this capstone, they have to choose from 3 different projects. One is sustainability and green. One is opening up a restaurant. And then the third one is marketing and communications, I think. Anyway, so they have 3 different assignments, 3 different choices of assignment. Within those 3 assignments, each week, each project is broken into 15 weeks. And they stay tracked together for the first several weeks, right? And all of them do the same thing. So all of them do an introduction, all of them do a literature review, all of them do an abstract. All of these different pieces sort of start them off, and then they branch out into their own segments. What this does is it allows them to work as a large group in the beginning. They can all kind of bounce ideas off each other. It breaks down this massive assignment into manageable chunks so that they can take bite-sized pieces, do it well, and then move on to the next piece with feedback from me. So if in their first section, if in their introduction, they're not even coming close to what I'm looking for, I catch them right in the get-go, right at the beginning, and I say, whoa, slow down. You need to look at this and this and this. This part's great, but you got to think about that. And so right from the get-go, they've got feedback from me. And each week that they turn in a piece of this project, they've got feedback from me. What's great about that is that at the end of the 15 weeks, I barely have to look at their projects because I've already looked at them 15 times. I can see them developing as they go. And stacking it like that makes it come together for them, because each time they do, if they're on week 4, they have to look at weeks 1, 2, and 3 again to make sure that there's flow, to make sure that it works. So each time they're looking at this week 4, if they're looking at 1, 2, 3, then that's another time for them to reabsorb the information and practice working with it again. So project-based learning is very, very effective. It's overwhelming in some ways in the beginning because, first of all, you have to learn how to write projects like that. It takes a lot of effort to make sure that you're really clear on the directions. You're really clear on what you expect. For that reason, I use a lot of exemplars. I put up examples. This is what a good project looked like. I obviously take the names off so that I don't out anybody, but I want to make sure that they see this is what I'm looking for. That's what I'm going for. And then the other thing I do is I save some of that feedback in a database. I'll talk about that in a minute, but it's just just remember that little trick. The next one on the list is peer-to-peer learning, right? And peer-to-peer learning is essentially, it's what it says it is. Students who teach other students tend to be really, they tend to explain things in a way that we never can. They tend to communicate to each other differently than we do to them, and somehow or another they get it. When another student explains it, they can use the same words, the same inflection, the same diagrams, but when another student explains it, it's like, oh yeah, I get it, that makes sense. Whereas if I explain it, they look at me like I've got 6 heads. So I try to utilize peer-to-peer learning a lot. I will create teams and I'll assign somebody to be the team captain, and they have to teach to the group. I give them the tips and I give them the pointers, and I make sure that I rotate it so it's not always the same person teaching. I also do an assessment to make sure that everybody's got it, and I go through the high points as well myself to make sure that everybody's getting it. So there's lots of different ways that I can attack peer-to-peer learning and make sure that they're not missing out on anything, while at the same time enjoying the benefits of working with peer students. And along that same vein is group-based learning, right? And group-based learning, we do a lot of that anyway here at Rush. People move off into their small groups, they talk about things, they come back together, and they present what they know. I think it's a fabulous way to learn. The key thing is to make sure that the groups are changed up and to make sure that not one person is doing all the talking and doing all the learning. Because a lot of times people will sit back quietly and not really be getting it, but they don't want to say anything because I don't want to look stupid in front of the group. So you have to be very careful with group-based learning, I think. At the end of the day, it's the facilitation of the different types of learning that provide the assessment measure. So observation checklists and rubrics are huge, but most important is how you're facilitating how these things unfurl, how these things happen for the students. So your goal as educators is to make sure that you anticipate what the problems are going to be and put in the instructions how to avoid those problems to begin with. Now, you don't want to get so detailed that you get bogged down and people overthink it, but you want to be detailed enough that the answers are at hand, or that you can point them to a place to dig for the answers. That's another piece of this that I think changes as we become better educators. It's not about us being the sage on the stage, dropping down the food into the baby robins' mouths, right? We don't, that's what they did in grade school. Now it's about developing those critical and creative thinking skills so that they go out and know where to look for information, so that they can go out and understand how do I get this? Where do I go for this? Right? And so, ultimately, our facilitation is the key measure of all this. When it comes to rubrics, I love them. I can't say enough good things about them. We could spend a day talking about rubrics. Absolutely, I will send some links along. And if you ever want to talk about how to write good rubrics, because there are good rubrics and not so good rubrics, we can spend time talking about that at another time. But just know that rubrics are important. And what's important about them, too, is that you make them available to students from the get-go. I've seen some instructors who want to hold back on sharing their rubrics because they don't want to give the students an in on what they're looking for. And I'm like, well, why would you not want the students to know what you're grading them on? Right? If I'm a student and I know that you're looking for this, then I'm going to go for that. I'm going to go for this. So if I know that to exceed standards, I have to do this, that, and the other thing, I'm going to work my tail off to make sure that I do this, that, and the other thing. I'm going to go down the list and I'm going to say, okay, I did this, great. I did that, awesome. I think I did that really well. Oh, I missed that. I better go back and check it out. And I'll go back and I'll work on my assignment again and make sure I incorporate that, whatever that was. So rubrics are they're a great motivator when they're used well. So we should talk about them some more, perhaps another day. I did break here for questions and thoughts. There were some good questions, mostly surrounding authentic assessment, and I can certainly talk more about that, but I'm going to keep going here in my redo of our recording. So jumping in with feedback tips, this is the meat of the matter, as I like to say. This is what we came here for, right? So feedback tips, essentially rethink how you're grading overall. I included a link to this article. I love this article because it upended, it explained how to upend your thinking on grading and how to stop thinking about it as a punishment or a meeting out of what you deserve, and instead having it be a guide. And I love that. I love that idea of as assessment as a guide. We talked about rubrics. Let's talk a minute about annotations. When you're going through and grading papers or anything really, you can annotate almost anything nowadays digitally, right? So if you're doing Word and you can just open it up, you can track changes as you're going through. The first time I read it through for content and understanding and just a general overview. Are the words flowing? The second time I read it through, I read it through for grammar and usage and mechanics and accuracy and detail. And then the third time I read it through, I do a quick screencast, not more than 3 to 4 minutes. And in that screencast, I track the changes. I go over the tracked changes that I made, or the tracked comments that I made. And I can say, so John, you did a really great job with this. You need to look at, I see a pattern of this particular behavior. Watch out for that. Make sure that you're doing this and that. Overall, I think you did this and that and blah. So I'm using that screencast to sort of capture what I did in the annotations. That I can already see people saying, "Oh my God, that's 3 times as long. I got to do this thing 3 times." You don't really. It's quick when you get into a rhythm, and you know what you're looking for. It's very quick to do feedback this way. And like I say, especially when the key is to just look at the assignments for those key pieces. You don't have to read every word every time, right? You read every word the first time through, but then after that, you're just highlighting those points that you need to correct. And then here again, Screencast-O-Matic. Another useful one is Audacity. Audacity. Whoops, let me back up just a minute. I'm not ready for that one. Audacity is an audio capture, which you can just download. It's free. It's pretty easy to use. You can use Screencast-O-Matic. That's what I'm using to capture this presentation since I forgot to record it. There's tons of different tools you can use, and again, I'll give you a list at the end. Not to worry. And we at City will teach you how to use them so that you're comfortable using the tools. And once you get comfortable using the tools, it gets really fast. I think, and a lot of the time people say, I don't have time. Most of the time when we don't have time, it's because we're not using the right tool for the right job. And so things take longer than what they need to do. We all know that, right? That's not any revelation. So the key is, where can I go to become more efficient? And that's one of the things that I think City does really well, is we can give you a tool that says, hey, try this, and then suddenly it works. So I just got through saying that there were no rules, right? Ditch the rules altogether, but now I'm going to give you 4 rules. And the first rule is be timely. So I like to say 24 to 72 hours to return grades. I know that's not realistic for all classes. I get it. But the quicker you can get feedback back in their hands, the quicker they can internalize it and apply it to what they're doing next. So if you turn in an assignment on week 1 and you don't get feedback until week 4, well, that's 3 weeks that have gone by that you didn't have feedback waiting for you. So it's really hard to know. It's really hard to catch up when the feedback takes that long. So if you can, get it back in their hands quickly. Sometimes that means doing a little bit less in depth, or sometimes it means doing a recording so that you can be faster. We talk faster than we write, always. So sometimes it means doing a quick recording for them. And sometimes it just means, really pressuring yourself to get that feedback back to them. You want to be as specific as possible. Here again, specific, achievable, and measurable, right? The time-honored way of getting anything specific. You want to give them specific ways to improve. Telling them that, well, this really wasn't up to standard doesn't help them nearly as much as saying you need to spend more attention to detail to this topic. You need to go into more depth with this idea. I need to see greater understanding of this concept, and you need to round out and apply these theories. So be specific. Tell them exactly what they need to do to get better. And if it's a perfect paper, find something to tell them to get. You need to find some way to give them to improve, because otherwise they're going to wonder, why am I here? If I can't improve anything, why am I bothering? So and again, I don't want to just give positive feedback, right? I want to give a balanced feedback. So the next rule of thumb is to be frequent. And again, it comes down to the idea of you don't want to wait 3 weeks to find out how you're doing. My daughter was in college this past year, and she didn't know how she was doing in any of her classes until the end of the semester. And she was really kind of lost because she was, well, I don't know how I'm doing, Mom, because I haven't gotten any grades back yet. And I was wondering to myself, okay, well, so if she's failing all her classes, I won't find out about it until after I've paid all the money. I'd like to know sooner so that we can take some steps and make sure that she's successful. As it turned out, she passed all of her classes with flying colors. She did great. But the idea is that the more often you can give feedback, the more often students are going to know how they're doing, and and that doesn't mean you pat them on the head every time they, smile at you. No, you give them targeted feedback. You want to give them a targeted boost here and there. If you notice somebody's doing really well on a quiz, and last week they struggled, a quick email or text or whatever saying, hey, I noticed you did really well in the test this week. Good job. They're going to notice that, and they're going to respond to that. They're going to want to do better. They're going to want to perform better for you. And then the last one is, of course, to be balanced. We talked a little bit about, good versus bad feedback. I always want to give students something to work on, even if their paper was fabulous. I always want to give them something good. I always want to give them something to work on, and I always want to end it with something good. However, I also want to be very careful. I also want to be very careful not to. As a student, I learned early on to just read the first line and the third line and ignore the stuff in the middle. And then I felt like I could say I was doing really well. Oh yeah, I did really great on that assignment. Yeah, she said this and this. I completely ignored the stuff in the middle because I didn't want to look at that, because that meant I wasn't doing well. I've learned. I now look for the stuff in the middle so that I can get better. But as a younger student, forget about it. Yeah, I was that student. Moving on in the feedback tips. Absolutely connect with your feedback. It's person to person. It's not just a number circled at the top of the page or a letter circled at the top of the page, right? You want to do things like use their first name, right? Or use their nickname, or use some story. Hey, I noticed that you answered this and you alluded to something that happened in class last week. That's great. Good connections. I like to see it when people make connections. If you can connect it, if you can, as the instructor, can connect it to something that they did a week ago. Hey, this is like what you wrote last week. I see that you've improved your ideas since then. You've added a lot of depth to how you're thinking about this. Anytime you can refer back, it shows that you are paying attention to them as students. It shows that you are caring about what they're doing. And if you care, they're going to care. We talked a little bit about connecting the dots, about alignment with learning objectives and connecting the dots. It's super important. Again, it's important enough that I'm saying it twice. Make sure that your learning objectives are clear, that they're posted, that they're out there, and that you can connect your assessments with those learning objectives. You want to make sure that they know why they're doing this. What does this have to do with what we're learning? I don't understand. Make the connections clear. Because once the connections are clear, they're going to internalize the information a lot more. This is a down and dirty trick I learned a long time ago. Save your comments in a document and then copy and paste and modify as you need to. So I have a file for good comments and a page for not so good comments, a page for average comments, and a page for, oh my God, really? Those are and the only thing I really, really, really encourage you to do is double check to make sure that you're checking for gender and names, so that Mark isn't getting Sally's feedback inadvertently. I didn't do this, but a friend of mine did. Posted feedback on the final. We had to do final assessments, and we had to write narratives. And it had to be a paragraph or two long. So he just used the same narrative all the time. and he regularly forgot to change the names out and the gender pronouns, so it got a little ugly. He lost his job very quickly because students pick up on that. One thing I like to use: automated fun challenges, hotspots, drag and drops, matching, flip cards. These are assessments, right? They're not feedback per se in terms of, narrative feedback, but they do give students feedback as to whether or not they're internalizing the information. If I do a quick flip card challenge, and it's a vocabulary challenge, if I can go through that challenge and I know all the answers right away without having to think about it, if I can just rattle it off without having to cheat, I know that I've internalized the information. That's assessment feedback, right? The flip cards are the assessment. The feedback is the fact that I got them right. And silly enough, these guys they're trained to learn through video failure, right? So video games throughout their young life have provided the opportunity. You go up against boss after boss after boss after boss in video games till you get to the big boss. So when I think about the small challenges, if I can win those easily, then I know that I'm going to do okay on the big challenge with the big boss, in this case a final exam. If I don't do well against the small challenges, then I know I'm not going to do well on the final exam. So anytime you can just do these quick little exercises and embed them into your content, then it gives the students an opportunity to test themselves and see how they're doing. So I think it's pretty important stuff. This one is huge, right? When it comes to feedback, don't set yourself up for failure, for heaven's sakes. If you have a bunch of students in your class, 60 students, and you give them a 30-page paper, you're going to have one heck of a long weekend reading those papers, right? Don't do that to yourself, right? Make the assessments such that they can either be graded automatically and you can just cross-check them. Do them with, again, the project-based learning where you stack it so it's not this massive thing that you have to wade through. I'm certainly a fan of if you can get somebody else to grade it, that's okay too, as long as they're approved to do that, a TA or what have you. But, set yourself up with reasonable expectations for your own abilities too. And then always, whenever you can, follow up with students, ask them, did the coaching help? Did this tip help you? Did that feedback help you to do better? You want to make sure that you're checking in with them to see, and you'll be able to see it too from their grades and from their performance in class and from their participation. If they're really engaged in participating, you can bet that your coaching is part of that reason. You're doing that. Your active participation in their learning is creating their willingness to engage. So, and again, here we paused for some questions and thoughts. There was some really good discussion about hotspots, and we talked about hotspots. We talked about H5P. I'll reference all those in the links that I provide. So I did want to give a quick nod to plagiarism because I think a lot of people are very, very concerned about plagiarism. First of all, in this day and age especially, it's really hard to... Dr. Google is everywhere, and everybody knows how to get them, and you can get them on your watch, for crying out loud. So unless you're going to have students strip down naked and take off all their electronic devices, they will find a way to cheat. They will. That's just, if you tell them no, they're going to find a way to do it. We have them sign an honor code. Right? They all have to sign the honor code. They all have to read the honor code first. There's a whole psychology of cheating and the goals and the pressures and the teaching to the test, all the things that have built up this culture of cheating. Realistically, I gotta tell you, a part of me says I don't necessarily... Cheating is not, and plagiarism is not the first thing on my mind. It's important, and when I catch it, I do look for it a lot. Almost every assignment I pass through, turn it in or whatever. But my goal is not to catch them cheating, but rather to take away the motivation to cheat in the first place. Because really, when they're cheating themselves. They're not learning what they need to learn. So you can do things to minimize cheating. You can have the Respondus lockdown browser. You can have the multiple Zoom cameras, honed in on their hands and doing scans of the room and whatnot. You can do all those things. They're still going to find a way. I'm 99% sure of it. you want to discourage cheating. You want to make sure that they know that you don't approve of cheating, but most importantly, you want to make it so that the reward for cheating is not there. So formulating assessments that require critical and creative thinking that reward their development are going to go a long way to reducing the impact of plagiarism. Because if they know that they're doing things that are going to forward their learning and make the learning mean something to them, if they understand why they're learning what they're learning and why you're assessing it, they're going to be much less likely to cheat. Most of them. And again, you're never going to get rid of it 100%. Definitely use the tools, use the Turnitin, use the Respondus lockdown browser, use the AI that we talked about in the session, use those pieces, but be aware that it's going to happen anyway. Learn to not teach just to avoid plagiarism. Learn to teach to support creative and critical thinking instead of teaching not to have plagiarism. I hope that makes sense. So we're rounding up on the last few minutes. I know I've covered a lot of ground. The key tips and takeaways for the whole thing are to use low-stakes assessments often and throughout, to use authentic assessment wherever you can, to balance your weights so that you don't have 100% of your course grade and their future lives resting on one exam, right? Break it out, spread the weight, spread the load. It's just common sense physics. If you spread the load, the house doesn't fall down. If you put the entire house weight on one 2x4, the whole thing crumbles. Rethink how you're grading overall. It's important enough I mentioned it twice, right? So you don't think about just grades, you think about learning and teaching. You want to remember the function of the assessment, to guide, not to punish. Not to necessarily, the function of the assessment should be to develop them further. You want to build and use rubrics wherever you can. We can talk about that in another session. You want to share those rubrics ahead of time so the students know that what they're supposed to produce before they produce it. And then always, always, always remember, it's not what you know, but how much you grow that ultimately matters. So if you start, with the learning down in the basement, and you end up at the first floor, you've come a long way. If you start on the first floor and you end up on the 35th floor, you're astounding, right? But both of those growth curves need to be appreciated for what they are. And so when you're doing your assessments, consider, where did this person start? Did they have any base knowledge, or are they coming in cold? Because that's going to make a difference in how you interpret the assessment process. And then finally, here's a huge list of different tools. We looked at the 75 different digital tools. We talked a lot about Animoto and a couple of the other ones. Flipgrid was on there, and Poll Everywhere we use here on campus. There's also some articles that I pulled out for you, and just some different toolboxes for you to hang on to and look at your leisure. I appreciate everyone coming today. I'm so sorry I forgot to record, but hopefully this will suffice. Have a great afternoon, and assess well. Take care, all. Oh, and if you do choose to do an evaluation, you can either point your phone at this QR code and it'll automatically take you to the site, or you can just click on the link and go to the evaluation form. I too like feedback, but just be kind. Seriously, I really do appreciate any evaluation that you want to give me. I like to learn and grow as much as the next person, and you can always reach out to me if you want more information or if you have different things you want to talk about. Just reach out to me at my email, margaret_checky@rush.edu. And with that, I will close. Have a great afternoon. Take care.